Hello and welcome to this video where I'm going to go through the basics of modulation matrix, what that actually is and what it does for you. So they're in the majority of synths in one form or another. There are some without because everything's just separate. But what a modulation matrix is you'll have some sources, which in this case I've got three, an ADSR, an LFO and a slider. So that's representing things like your modulation wheel or your pitch wheel at the side of the keyboard on a regular synth. You've obviously got the mixer, and in this case it's the wonky stuff MM33. And then you've got your destinations. So the matrix mixer, the big thing is that you've got more than two outputs. In this case I've got three. It obviously very much depends on your synth, how many inputs and how many outputs you'll have. I mean, some of the digital synths, it's literally can be hundreds. Then what the knobs do is they set the level of that signal to that destination. So you can see I've wired this one in. The fader is going to input 1, which is this row. And I've already wired in the VCO pitch to output X, which is this column. So you can see I've got one pot. I'm going to wire these others a go. So what I'm planning to do is that this one will then control, because this is row 1 is the fader. Then anything I do on this fader, I can control the amount it goes to the VCO pitch in this case. And in fact, we'll do it now. Then for the second output Y, I can actually see. I'm going to take my glasses off because I kept banging them on the camera stand. That goes to the filter. And then output Z, or Z for our American cousins. So we'll have that go to the delay. I haven't bothered with any VC or anything or needing any trigger because of this. I thought this made it clearer. So if I turn the volume up a little bit, and I can demonstrate now, just make sure everything's turned off. See, that's why you make sure everything's turned off. So what I'm going to do now is, so we've got input 1, the fader, and I'm going to turn up the output X, which is going to the VCO pitch. So because if I move this down, so the higher up the slider is, the higher the pitch is going to go. So what I would do is I'd turn this up to full, and let's say that's the top pitch I wanted to go to. So whatever I do, it won't go any higher pitch than that. And obviously got all the holes in the middle. If I wanted it to be lower still, obviously I can just lower the knob a bit more. Okay, so because this source is also can be sent to the other two, I'll turn it off the filter, and I'll now bring in turn it off the VCO, and I'll bring in the filter. So now, if I turn up the middle one, which is output Y, which is what I put to the filter, so the same applies now. So again, I put it at maximum, and I don't want the filter to get any more open than that from the knob, so from the fader. Sorry. So in effect, all I've done there is I've just moved control of the cutoff frequency. I don't have to twiddle that knob. I can move this slider, and that can be useful for performance and things. And you control the maximum amount. And all modulation basics will have. You can set how much of the modulation you want. So. And these are attenuators in effect. So this is what mixers do. So let's turn that back off again. Turn it there, and then just to show you, we'll turn up the delay. It does help if I make it off drop. Not there you go. So if I now turn up the pot C, a bit more subtle, but it's important. This is one of the things I wanted to emphasise: is things don't always have to be ultra demonstrative. You can just have something that's quite subtle. It might be more for you than the listeners of your music, but it can help you with your composition. You know, if you've got a bit more of an interesting lead sound, for instance, you might get more inspired in what sort of melody you write or something like that. Okay, so that was just one modulation source going to all three destinations. We can do all three at once. You know, this is the whole point. Yeah. So, yeah. I'll stop messing. Sorry, I get too interested sometimes. So I'll turn it all off. So we've now got the other sources. So let's bring in the LFO, because everybody likes LFOs. So we'll have that go to input 2. So that's this middle row. So you can see all I've done, I've turned up I've turned up the level to go to output X from number 2. So that's this LFO, and you can see the pitch is changing in time with that light. If I mess with this, does help if we do the right one. Sorry, there's actually two LFOs in this unit, and I forgot. So when I'm thinking about what I'm going to say, I'm not paying so much attention to what I'm fiddling with. Okay, but of course you can, because it's a modulation matrix, if I want some of the fader as well, okay, so let's turn that LFO off for a moment, because now we'll do exactly the same thing, but with the ADSR. ADSRs can be really, really handy because they give you a much more predictable result, if you like. Sorry, this is where I could do with my glasses. I'm just paying attention for a moment while I try and stab the bloody thing. There we go. And I'll put that into output 3. So as I was saying, ADSRs are more predictable, if you like. They are activated when they're triggered, which is normally when you press your key on your keyboard, but in this case, it can be an LFO, or it could be when your sequencer gate comes out, as per my last video, and then it's giving you a very definite, you know what you're getting from these. And some can be turned into LFOs in their own right, just very slow ones. That's what the end 4 is for on the ADSR. If you put the lead into there and put it into the gate in on the ADSR on this module, it'll actually repeat. When it gets to the end of its cycle, it triggers itself again and it goes through again. So even if it gets a really slow LFO, quite handy thing that. And most synths will have some sort of interesting things like that, or just an extra little feature that just makes it a bit more versatile as a rule. But it is one of the great things about Modular, is that they quite often do this sort of thing by default, really. So let's get this doing something. So if I turn the so we're now on input 3, so these 3, So you can see now, as per the trigger, I'll just turn it down a little bit so it triggers a bit slower. Okay, so, and again, we can have all three things, so let's put a bit of LFO on. I can't remember if I left any fader on or not, so you can still hear the ping, whatever you want to call it, where it goes higher of the ADSR. You've still got the vibrato of the LFO, but I'm controlling the general level of the pitch by the fader. So that's all three going to one. So of course you can do that. So let's get rid of the LFO. But there's no reason that you can't. Let's put the LFO. So let's say we want the LFO to change the delay time a little bit. So that was output Z for the delay, and input 2. So input 2 to Z. It's fairly subtle, but you can hear it. I'll turn the volume up here, that might help. Okay, so let's mess with the frequency now on the So let's put a little bit of LFO into the filter. So again, the LFO is number 2, and it's picked Y. Now let's say I want to really control that by the fader. Something I've mentioned about the A modular before. Obviously, on the module itself, I'm setting the lowest level I want of the filter cutoff, and because I can only increase the filter cutoff. As I said before, there are ways around it, but for the sake of these demonstrations, it's simplest to state this. So now I can open the filter. Take it down a bit more. So what the fader is actually doing there is we've got a bit of VCO change and a bit of filter cutoff change. Not directly related. Depends how you completely control the quantity is completely controlled by how you set the knobs. Let's stop that wobbling. Okay, so we'll just silence that for a moment. I'm not sure why it's gone totally silent. I've done something to it. Right, okay, sorry, yes, I'd turned the filter cutoff right down. I'd forgotten, hadn't I? Like I say, I tend to concentrate on what I'm trying to say, that I'm trying to say it clearly, and I do keep umming and ahhing, but I try not to. I'll probably do it more in real life. So the next bit I wanted to go on to, he says probably me, is this is obviously a very small modulation matrix. An MS2000, I'll be showing you later, has got 8 or 9, I can't remember off the top of my head, sources and 8 or 9 destination, and some of the digital synths have even more. One of the really good things where you can is to have the performance control going into the modulation matrix, like that's partly what I was demonstrating with the fader, because that just gives you more options of just subtle variations. The thing could be recording and playing itself all manually, and you could just add that little bit of interest by changing things slightly. So you've got things like joysticks, faders, mod wheels I've mentioned before. There's the pitch wheel, some synths will let you play with that, and then the other things. Some synths have things like this. This is the BIOT module that's been updated. There's a new module, I think it's called the KX or something, I can't remember now, by Wonky Stuff again. And basically they're touch plates, and your finger generates a signal that you can use as a modulation source. They can be quite good. There's ribbon controllers is another one. So there's loads of options to get other CVs in there. Obviously, if you've got a synth with the patch bay, it might be that patch bay means you can feed other modulations in that way. But it's whether those modulations can go into your modulation matrix. But as long as you can get that modulation to the destination you want it to go to, if you want a foot pedal to go to your filter cutoff, for instance, that's always a fun one. That can be really good. I think these are demonstrated fairly, the most common things. You've got envelopes, LFOs, performance controls, or the other thing this was representing was a keyboard CV. They're your very normal sources. There are other things. And one of the most common ones is to have your keyboard CV go to the filter, so that the filter opens slightly as you play higher notes. Otherwise, because what happens, it will actually gradually get quieter because you're cutting off more of the signal as you get higher if you don't gradually raise the filter cutoff. LFOs can go absolutely anywhere, just to our private interest. Some can be synced to tempo, but I personally prefer not to sync them to tempo. I just think it's more interesting if they just do some things of their own that's got no relation to the time of the song. And I'd quite often do things like filter resonance is a favourite of mine to do. I do it on the filter cutoff, sometimes on bass lines in particular. And it's quite fun, but it has to suit your song, obviously, to do other things like putting it onto delays or other effects, messing with your effects. But what I'd always say to you is you can have the best modulation matrix in the world, you could have the best sounding synth in the world, but it's got to fit with the piece of music you're writing. Just always use your ears, I suppose, is what I'm getting towards again. The other thing I would just mention before finishing off is that some synths will actually record the modulation matrix. Some of the Korg spring to mind. I think the Monologue certainly does. I think some of the cheap Behringer things do as well. The Crave and those sorts of things, I believe they do. They can record your knob movements. So, like in effect, like if I was doing that, they would record that, so you could change the level and actually record it as part of your sequence. So knowing your piece of gear is really helpful, and that can be really handy. Especially if you it's an important part of the song, like for instance, acid bass lines. Without that high resonance filter and twiddling it, it just wouldn't be the same thing, and that can be recorded in most synths these days. One thing I forgot to record was the difference between a matrix mixer and regular mixers. So the biggest difference, I believe I mentioned in the core of the video, was the fact that you'll have more than two outputs. The vast majority of mixers will have two outputs. That's one for each side of stereo. It is possible, obviously, to mix to mono, one signal, because all you do is you just pan everything to one side. People usually use the right channel, but there's no real reason to. So you pan everything to the right channel and just use the right output on that mixer. You do find mono mixers, particularly for mixing CVs. So here's a good example. So the Polar Mix module on the A Modular, we've got three inputs. These are your levels. There's an offset, so basically you can set a base or minimum voltage. This is also one of the areas where I said before about where you can't go downwards. This can make, using the Polar Mix means sometimes you can go downwards. But that's a topic for another video one day. And you can see there's only one out. So this is a good example. This would be called a 3-to-1 mixer. You've got three inputs to one out. But like I said, the vast majority of mixers, certainly for audio, are two outs for stereo. And you'll see things like 12-2, 6-2 are quite common. 12-2 is quite common. My main studio mixer is a 22-4-2 mixer. So it's got 22 inputs and two outputs. And the extra 4 in the middle means I've got 4 groups, so I can allocate groups. And what these are used for on posher mixers, they don't exist on cheap mixers because they obviously add more circuitry and stuff, is you can actually allocate a group of inputs to, say, be the drums and have an overall level for the drums. Or another group might be you've got the pads or two keyboards playing together in the mid range, and you just need to control them together. So if you see 3 numbers, it means you can do submix groups, if you like. They're in effect almost making submixes. So you can still play with the levels of the inputs, but you've got another control of levels before you get to the levels of the outputs. Yeah, and I hope that wasn't too confusing. If it was, please do just say in the video, in the comments, or message me and I'll explain better. And I'd like to do a video about the basics of mixing one day, which is on my list for one day. If there is any subjects you'd like me to cover going forwards, this really sort of, I don't assume you know anything, so I'm explaining any terms I use. But as I get further in, I will assume you've watched my previous videos, like I talked about oscillators and ADSRs, and I haven't explained what an ADSR is because my previous videos have covered those. So, thank you. So to wrap up this video, I thought we'd just come away from the AE Modular and we'd have a look at the Korg MS2000, because this is another one that is pretty graphic at showing you a modulation matrix. So if I zoom in to here, Korg is wanting to do where they name things different names. It's virtual patch, but this is a modulation matrix. And you'll see here we've got these sources. So what is it, 8? And you've got 8 destinations. And you switch between them by doing that. Okay, so LFO2 is now going to the LF2 frequency, so it's doing it itself. Do that. LFO2 is now being vibrato on the pitch. I'll do keyboard tracking, so that's your keyboard CV. And I wanted it to do the noise level, so I could have the noise increase as the keyboard got higher pitched. Or what you'd normally put it on is the filter cutoff. That would be a normal thing. And you see this is how much. So these 4 knobs here are how much. So these are the 4 patches. 1, 2, 3, and then back to 1 again for 4. And then you sort of that. So that's about as straightforward as you ever get them. Let's say this is the attenuators, if you like, and how the level is. So, by modern synth standards, not a big modulation matrix at all, but it works well. It's easy to use, and the synth sounds great. So, what more could you ask for? And hence why it's one of my favourite synths. Okay, I hope you found this useful, and as always, any questions, queries, or comments, you're most welcome. Via the comments section, or you can message me direct. I'm perfectly willing to answer. Thanks, bye.